Hi, Margaret.
Hi,
Thank
how
you
are
for
you?
joining us. Dr. Margaret Cook, the author of this great book, is going to tell us a little bit about her approach to research and so on. It's something that makes me really curious because there are so many different ways we can research the world. And of course, curious is a research in itself. So in a sense, I'm conducting research now by talking to you, Margaret. How are you?
I'm well. Good to talk to you.
Thank you very much for joining us. So Dr. Margaret Cook wasn't until last year or early this year working for us at USC in our history program, but she's gone on to other things. What are you doing now, Margaret?
I'm now at Griffith University working in the Australian Rivers Institute, which is building on that book you showed me, looking at rivers, and now I'm looking at an even bigger river system, the Murray-Darling Basin, because there's a few problems there I can look at.
There are a few problems. I think that's an understatement, but yes, you're quite right. So, I mean, I've basically got three questions for you, Margaret. But before we start, why do you research, and and what called you into this area of work within history?
You've already tapped into it already. I'm insatiably curious. People often think that history in particular is about about dates, but I tell my students it's not about when. They can look that up on Google. It's about why. That's what I always want to know. So when I travel around the world and I get to a place, I wonder why they're there. Is it a sugar town? Is it on a river? Why? How long have people been there? So how's another good question. So I basically see the world and think, well, how did we get to here? Because that's the thing for history, is history helps me explain the present. So by looking back to it, I can see what's happened in the past that might have shaped today. And it might even give me a few glimpses into what might happen tomorrow.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you, because as you know, I'm both a historian and a futurist, and I sort of jump between the two.
Yep.
To me, it seems that looking at your book, that there's a lot of stuff that's potentially going to inform possible policy decisions and future decisions of different kinds. And you've been interviewed a lot since, the triple El Ninos or whatever it was that we had last year. You've been all over the place. And I'm assuming that the interest there was as much as tell us how or why, like you're saying, but also not necessarily crystal ball gazing or predicting, but, what kind of things need we as a society, need we as regulating bodies and so on, we need to be aware of? Have you had that much?
Yeah, I've had it a lot. And I think that's really important because my background before I was an academic was a public historian. And so I really like the fact that history can be really applied to real life problems. And so I find that my history insights can inform that. So I find things like in a flood situation, which is something I've talked about a lot, it's the elderly and the vulnerable that are at most risk. An elderly person can't evacuate their house as well. A physically disabled person can't get out of a lift, or if it's flooded. Or I've discovered that some building materials are better than others, or some areas are worse than others. And so I'm trying to bring those insights from my history research into policy so that we can maybe stop making the same mistakes, because history does repeat itself a bit. And the one thing I hope that we can do by learning from history is to try and minimize the worst of our mistakes. Maybe that's a bit dreamy, but that's what I'd like history to do.
Well, I get asked often, well, what's the relevance of history today, other than in understanding why or how we got here? Perhaps it's explanatory, but I think it also has a predictive dimension or an anticipatory. Maybe that's a better word, anticipatory dimension.
I agree, yeah. And, things we can anticipate and we can also prevent. So I think it's really important that we understand the cultural context. I think history is really good for the context, as well as, this is the how and the why. We make decisions because they're based on our philosophical or religious approach, our cultural values. And what history can show us is what those are. So when you've got a better idea of what people value and how people think, maybe, you can maybe start anticipating how they might think in the future, given a similar set of circumstances.
Yep, that's excellent. So I'm going to leap into my questions for you now, Margaret. So what's the purpose of research then, for you, broadly speaking?
It's to try and explain the present for me. That's to try and give yourself a difficult question, something maybe you might not have thought about before, or someone else has asked you, and you think, how and why? How did this happen? So for me, it's about helping me understand things I don't understand.
Yeah. Okay. So your approach to research, I would imagine you go to archives and stuff, but you mentioned interviewing. Can you tell us more about your approach to research?
Yeah. Look, it depends a lot on the question you're asked. I was a consultant historian, so sometimes it might be a very work-focused question, like how long's this house been and what's the history of the house? And that's to help us restore it or something. Or in the case of floods, it's to try and explain that to a different audience or to policymakers. So that affects how I do that process. So for me, one of my happy places is the archives. I go to the archives, I put in a request, and there's literally a brown paper parcel tied up with string comes to my desk. And it is one of my favorite things, to quote The Sound of Music. And I open it up, and it's the closest thing I get to time travel, because I open it up and in those pages are the voices and the thoughts and the handwriting of the past. Yep. And I get an insight into those people, and it's as close as I'll get to time travel because I can take myself back into that time. So my process is very much determined on what my question is. So if it's about how people have lived on the river last year, I'll be doing oral history. I'll be chatting to people. But if I'm looking at how engineers managed Somerset Dam in the 1930s, I'll be into Brisbane City Council archives or the State Rivers records. So again, the research process is determined by the question. And that's half the fun of it, is working out where I might actually find those answers. That needle in the haystack, where might it be hiding?
Yep, I'm coughing away. I'm thinking about something that I've noticed on LinkedIn. You've been pushing the campaigning for Trove.
Yep.
Can you tell us how Trove features in your own work, and possibly obviously for students and just the general public as well?
Yeah, well, the Trove is the database of the National Archives of Australia, National Library of Australia, I should say. Yep. And it's just, Trove is such a great name because it's a treasure trove. In there, it's got lots of digital newspapers up to 1954. It's got photographs, it's got diaries, it's got old books, it's got all sorts of things. And the reason I've been agitating to save it is partly because the funding is under threat, but I almost use it every day. And that's without exaggeration. I am always looking at newspapers. Floods are a very visual thing in particular, so I use photographs a lot. So I'm old enough that I researched before we had Trove, and I don't really want to go back there because I understand how difficult it actually is. And also, if you're in regional Australia or even the Sunshine Coast, flying to Canberra is quite a challenge, to say nothing of expensive. And so what I think is Trove's very democratic. It allows anybody who can get access to a free internet service to be able to look at the resources. And I think that's really important. The democracy of information is something I actually think is a big value that I'd like to, support.
Yeah, that's great, because of course academia can be very elitist in a sense. So we've got tools like Trove which democratize the research process. That's great. Well, thank you for that. Was a little bit of a segue, but it was a very relevant one, I think. Before we leap onto the third question, so you use Microfiche and all that sort of stuff in the long past. I remember Microfiche. I had to use it a lot. Yeah, and I still use Microfiche because Trove tends to only have newspapers before 1954. So if you're doing any recent history, you're looking at Microfiche anyway. And I'm sure that's why I wear glasses, because it's really hard on your eyes. It's flashing in front of you. You're weaving back and forth, rewinding. So I don't miss it. I also use Microfiche, where I used to look up things like marriages, deaths and births and so on. And now some of that's on ancestry.com, which you can now look at in public libraries as well. So that's another a source that I use quite a lot that's become easier to use. Fantastic. So my last question for you is, what are you doing now? You've already hinted at it in your introduction, but can you tell us a little bit more, expand on that? Yeah.
we're looking at the Murray-Darling Basin, and particularly we're looking at the cultures that are associated with Murray-Darling, because a lot of the public debate, and then we're getting back to that lovely point you made at the beginning about the applied nature and voices that are missing from history, is the Murray-Darling is often the story of the irrigators. You know, it's the story of the people who are growing agriculture and extracting all that water all the time. And what we're trying to look at is the other people who use the rivers. So the Aboriginal weavers who use the reeds, and the reeds are dying, or the fisher folk who are struggling because now the European carp are taking over their waters and they can't get their native species that they've always fished. So we're looking at those sorts of different things. So one of the things that I think history can do is bring those disparate voices to the table. So you can actually challenge some of those really loud narratives that we constantly hear in the newspaper, and know that there's other voices, and those voices are often silenced by, you know, mainstream media in particular. And so it's really important. In my research, I try and find, if particularly in, say, the area of floods, it's often a male-dominated thing. It's about male engineers changing the river. And so I'm trying to find the women's voices or nature's voices. You know, where are the pelicans in that? It's a totemic species. Where are they?
Yeah, that was something that really, when I first came across your work, really attracted me. That it's a river with agency, with a people problem or a city problem. And I thought that was a very, for me, it was a really, I reacted emotionally to that, because nature often gets left out. So, and this is another form of democratization, I would suggest.
Yeah. So
you're democratizing voice.
Yeah, I am. And one of the things that I like about environmental history, which is what I do more of now, is often in history, the nature's just the backdrop. It's just the scenery. So, you know, you tell World War II histories, and you mentioned that the snow was a player in stopping the troops, but the snow actually has agency. It actually impacted on the outcome of the war. And so I really like that you can flip that. So you can not necessarily make snow dominant, but make the snow even part of that story, because often it's left out.
Yep, exactly. So they're my three questions. But, you know, I just had one pop into my head that I think would be worth ending on. We've got researchers at uni listening to this, hopefully, a few, and students, of course. What would you say would be one or two things that you would recommend a good researcher do?
Read a lot. I think it's really, really important that you read, and eclectically if you can. I don't think it really matters, particularly if you're talking about your writing. The more you read, the better you'll write is one of the things. And also, don't be afraid. Sometimes, you know, you go down a rabbit hole, and they're fun, they're very distracting, but sometimes a rabbit hole is the most profitable thing you'll do. And that's sometimes where you find that gold. So don't lose your sense of curiosity and wonder. Kids are really good at it, and we tend to lose it a bit more as we get older. And I think it's really important when you're researching that you don't close your mind to any answer. You don't set the question that you already know the answer. Make the question as broad as you can, and be prepared to let the sources change your question, because it definitely should change your answer. Yeah.
And for me, I always argue with the word answer. It's more like a response, because really there's answers sort of close things down.
Yeah.
Would you expand on that a little bit, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I did as a third-year student in my degree is history about truth. And, you know, you and I could probably debate that for about an hour, I'd suggest, because it's not. Because it's very important that you realise your own positionality, you understand what your sources, where they're coming from. Everyone's got a bias. So as an historian, you have to know your bias. So I think that's really important too, that yes, you're only ever going to write your version of history or your interpretation of the sources, but be true to those sources. Don't falsify them. Be as wide and as broad ranging as you can. Try and get those disparate voices. Don't be seduced by the loudest noise in the room. Try and find those other people who have been overlooked in history often. And it's really important. Since the 1970s, we've started to really look at, you know, race and gender and class, and we've put environment into that frame. And I think it's really important. to your previous question about, as an historian, what should you do? And I think you should be attuned to all of those ideas and all of those players.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I think that makes me very happy, that response. Yeah, so Margaret, I want to thank you for giving us this bit of time. And, you know, I wish you all the luck in the world with your new role in the Centre of what
Australian Rivers Institute.
Oh, the Australian Rivers Institute. Yeah. So that's fantastic. So take care and thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you as always.